Good morning again to everybody, and welcome to this breakfast conference organized by the Spanish Committee of the World Petroleum Council and the Spanish Energy Club, and sponsored by CORES. Our special guest today is John Cooper, the Director General of FuelsEurope. I'm sure that still some of us talk about Europaea, but let's say FuelsEurope and Concawe, the two arms of the refining European industry in Brussels. So many thanks, John, for having accepted our invitation. It is a real honor to have you with us and have the opportunity to hear from you firsthand about the current scenario of the European oil industry and its foreseeable future. There is only one thing we know about the future, and is that we are going to face plenty of uncertainties. The last years, we have witnessed the big changes that the energy sector has experienced worldwide, including those related to the increasing consumption of countries outside the OECD, the developments of new strategies and technologies, or the progress towards a more sustainable energy world, with the pledges made by more than 170 countries before they meet in Paris these days, just to mention a few of them. For oil in particular, the market is at a moment which we feel quite uncomfortable, with the sudden drop in prices and the possibility that the current scenario extends. With all the geopolitical uncertainties surrounding our industry, including the possibility that Iran returns to oil markets thanks to the nuclear deal, or the chance that the shale revolution goes at global level. We face, as we said, an unknown future, but it's crucial that we try to understand it, especially if we want to succeed on the need to combine economic development with the obligation of doing it in an environmentally acceptable manner. This is one of the great challenges of the 21st century, not only for the energy sector, but for the society as a whole. We are currently facing an unprecedented event in the human history, since the effort to stop the global warming implies the obligation to reach a multilateral global agreement. This is what we all hope to achieve these days in Paris, including the energy industry, because in order to undertake the necessary investments, we need to have clear signals that the transition to a more sustainable model is real and that its playing field rules are also clear for everyone. As you know, the European Union has taken a position of leadership over the past 2 decades in fighting climate change. This commitment has led us to have great advances in environmental matters and technology development. This has been in part thanks to the significant efforts made by our industry with the implementation of a wide range of measures, both in the supply and the demand sides. The Spanish refinery sector, for example, has made a major investment effort during the recent years, with a accumulated CapEx over 7 billion euros to meet the necessary requirements. In fact, the Spanish refineries are a reference nowadays in innovation, flexibility, and sustainability at the international level. Let me just quote a figure that I consider relevant. Emissions per barrel of crude refined in our facilities have fallen about 40% since 1990. However, as you know very well, this road has not been easy at all, with sometimes undesirable relevant economic effects and loss of competitiveness, particularly on those sectors with intensive use of energy and which are susceptible of delocalization, as is the case of the refining industry. Europe represents only about 10% of global emissions, so it's its work in this area must be followed by the rest of regions. Otherwise, we will see how the competitiveness of our industry is going to be punished. We need to be ambitious because our planet is at risk, but at the same time, we have to be realistic because if other countries do not commit, Europe alone will not be able to stop global warming. Let's put our hopes in the European diplomacy and the weight of its soft power, based on norms and values, to convince the other countries and get a global agreement in Paris. There are many reasons to talk about oil in this context. A fuel which demand is about 90 million barrels per day and will reach, based on the World Energy Outlook of this year, over 103 million barrels per day in 2040, still representing 26% of the total primary energy supply at global level, as well as oil being a key, and refining a key strategic sector, which is in a critical moment and need a particular attention in Europe. This is why we consider that John's speech entitled, "What Should Climate Leadership Look Like for Europe? Considerations for the Regulation and Competitiveness of Our Refining Industry and Transport," fitting very well with our current commitments and our current interests and concerns. So just before passing, giving the word to John for his speech, I would like to repeat our acknowledgement to CORES for the sponsorship, to the World Petroleum Congress for the whole efforts, and particularly for the initiatives in order to organize this set of conferences, and ask Pedro Mires to address a few words to us before passing to John.
Thank you. Thank you, Pedro, for your kind words. And before giving the floor to John Cooper, let me say several words about the WPC and the things that we're organizing nowadays. First of all, good morning to everyone, and it's a great pleasure to have you here in this new event that has been organized by Enerclub and the World Petroleum Council. And let me say some words about the Spanish committee. I think that all of you know that the World Petroleum Council is a non-advocacy, non-political organization. It has also accreditation as a non-governmental organization from the United Nations. Let me say that national oil companies and international oil companies, OCDE and non-OCDE countries, producers and consumers, governments, academic institutions, and companies come together in this organization in order to promote sustainable management and the use of global petroleum resources for the benefit of all of us. Just as the Spanish Energy Club, the WPC does not have a formal position on issues, but does act as a forum to bring together dialogue between the various sectors of society with the views of specific matters. Spain is one of the 70 member countries of the WPC from around the world. Since I was named chair of the committee in 2012, we have aimed to broaden the Spanish oil and gas industry participation and visibility in the WPC activities. But also, what we are doing today, we are trying to bring to the Spanish industry some of the most relevant authorities in the oil and gas international area. 2015 has been a very busy year for our committee. We have developed an important number of activities thanks to the enormous work and enthusiasm of our committee members, whom I would like to thank for their contributions effort. There are three main lanes of action of the WPC Spanish Committee. First is enhancing international visibility of the Spanish oil and gas sector. Second, increasing awareness of the WPC activities here in Spain. And last but not least, launching the Spanish Youth Committee. We have several representatives here. Concerning the first line of action, this year we have participated in WPC publications, and our companies have been presented in very relevant events such as the first WPC Leadership Conference in Responsibility, Cooperation and Sustainability held in Norway last May, or the WPC Tomorrow's Leader Symposium held in Budapest last autumn. Speaking about increasing awareness of WPC activities in Spain, each year we host 2 WPC events, which top international profile speakers and institutions such as the WPC, the Department of Energy of the United States, the IEA, like we did in May last year with Mr. Salamori here, and this is a case of today's event with Mr. Cooper and FuelsEurope. And the third line of activities has to do with young people. Young talent is probably the biggest asset that our industry has, and it is crucial to attract and retain in order to ensure a competitive oil and gas sector today and in the future generations. This is the reason we have decided to support the setup of a large Spanish youth oil and gas network under the umbrella of the WPC. Since the last launch of the Spanish Youth Committee and until now, more than 260, I will repeat, 260 young professionals have registered into this initiative. We are always organizing and developing new activities in order to keep this initiative always active and rolling. We have created a website, offer young professionals the chance to attend international events, help them to participate in mentoring programs, or launch the Youth Spanish Petroleum Hour, the first one, in which you can learn more about the WPC Spanish Youth Committee website. Today, we have also started with a new initiative in order to engage them in our more senior activities and bridging the generation gap by increasing communication and promoting young participation. We have invited a young professional to participate in today's conference. It's very easy to recognize them. I hope this initiative is held in the future and help us to people to get a bit closer together, share interests and knowledge. A couple of months ago, when we started thinking about who would be interesting speaker to invite to address a conference in Spanish WPC, John Cooper came immediately to our minds. As the new Director General of FuelsEurope and Concawe, he is a privileged position to have a clear perspective of European oil and gas strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. John Cooper took up the position of Director General of FuelsEurope and Concawe in April 2015, joining the Brussels team from BP in London. John started his career in the motor industry, working on future powertrains for lower emissions, and then after 3 years, they moved to the petroleum refining and marketing industry, where he now has some 27 years of experience. His previous role was taking the lead of BP's strategy for compliance with renewables, greenhouse gas regulation in Europe transport fuels. He also had business leadership roles in aviation fuels and lubricants, transport, energy policy engagement, and fuels technology in the UK and the United States. And since 2011, he also represents the UK fuels industry and the UK government-led Automotive Council Technology Group. And many times in his career, he has also worked closely with consumers across the whole spectrum of transport sectors to understand the use of fuels and petroleum products for the transport needs and also to improve the outcomes. Mechanical engineer by training, he holds a Bachelor in Engineering from Cambridge University. He's a Chartered Engineer and Fellow of the UK Institution of Mechanical Engineers and chairs the Board of Industrial Advisor at Cambridge University Engineering Department. John is married, and with his wife, Paso, they have 2 sons. When we contacted him, he immediately showed the disposition to be here today and even proposed a topic, which I think is a great interest for all of us. Under the title, What Should Climate Leadership Look Like for Europe? As Pedro Mero first mentioned, Mr. Cooper will be analyzing some of the main considerations that climate policies has for the regulation and competitiveness in our refining and transport industry. So I would very much like to show my gratitude for having accepted the invitation. Now you have the floor, and after that we will open the floor for Q&A session. Thank you, John.
Pedro, many thanks. Pedro, many thanks. Does this microphone work okay? Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay, thank you. First of all, I should say buenos dias, buongiorno, bonjour, guten tag, good morning. Did I miss anybody? All right, good. Okay, thank you. First thing I'd like to say is happy to take questions during the talk as well as afterwards. It's nice to have something more of a conversation. If it's a hard question, I'll pick one of my colleagues to try and answer it. If it's a long question, maybe we'll come back to it later. But however you like. So the topic of the talk this morning is about what should climate leadership look like for Europe, and naturally, with being from FuelsEurope, the refining industry, this is very much from the perspective of the refining of petroleum and the uses we make of petroleum. I'm hoping that you will have on your table somewhere a copy of the open letter that we've recently published and also sent to commissioners and key institutions across Europe. That's something I'll just reference as we talk and go through. So the plan is, I think, to do this for about 45 minutes, and I've got quite a bit of material to get through. Some of it is more complicated than others. Anyway, let's make a start and see how this goes. So first of all, an introduction to FuelsEurope. FuelsEurope is the organization for the downstream petroleum industry in Brussels, representing the industry to the institutions. We take part and participate and represent the industry in negotiation with the European Commission in particular, but also the European Council and Parliament, the MEPs, in the way that regulation is developed and implemented on the refining industry and also in transport fuels. We have 42 member companies, and that represents 100% of refining capacity across Europe. So the agenda for today, for this morning, we will cover these topics. First of all, something about the idea of climate leadership in Europe and FuelsEurope's position on climate change. And then we'll talk about refining in Europe in a global context. And why is the global context important? Then we'll say something about the decarbonization of transport. I think most people have heard something about government initiatives about decarbonization of transport, more efficient cars and electric cars and things like that, and how do we move forward there. And from those themes, then we can pull some conclusions together and then have some further discussion. Am I missing something here? Right. Okay. So what should climate leadership look like for Europe? So we'll look at two main areas, and in the European context, but also in a global role. The regulation of refinery sites. In particular, that covers ETS, the flagship policy in Europe for decarbonizing the economy, the emission trading scheme, and the refining competitiveness and how those two come together. And those are quite short-term impacts. I'm sure many of us here are closely involved with refineries and the performance and the business of refining. And those of us doing that will know straight away ETS costs are rising and a significant part of the costs of a refinery now. And then, like we've said, transport CO2 regulation for both fuels and vehicles. And these have longer-term effects for our industry and for society. If you buy a vehicle today, it'll be on the road for 15 years, and the fuel demand for that vehicle is then basically set for 15 years. And then I think most of us will be aware that Europe is aiming for leadership in the climate debate in Paris. It's almost impossible to escape the news, certainly the news channels that we see in our industry and our association in Brussels. We have several reports every day from progress in Paris around what's happening in COP21. And Europe is very clearly seeking to take a leadership position there. Right. So in terms of FuelsEurope's position on climate change, I think you can see from the letter that we've put there, we have been very clear that we recognize climate change as a global challenge requiring global action. And we've set out a number of points, including a call for a legally binding agreement across all key countries to level the playing field for decarbonization across the world, to address it in a global manner. And you can see, I can leave it to you later to read the letter if you wish. In terms of the global picture then, global energy demand, there's a lot of information available, and we don't have the time to go through the key areas here. But there's one graph here that I show you. This is work from the BP Energy Outlook to 2035, which looks at the growth of energy demand by region, with the green sector there being OECD countries, and Asia, non-OECD Asia in yellow, and other countries in grey. And the key takeaway from this graph, you can see actually OECD countries have basically flat energy demand. All the growth is outside of OECD. It's not shown on this particular graph, but there is plenty of work to also show that the trend continues out to 2050, as per all reasonable predictions. And one thing that is really prominent is the growth of the use of coal, in particular in India and China. And I think only just a few days ago, India announced its intention to double its coal output by 2020 even. So we should have this perspective that Europe sits in a much bigger world, and the growth is happening mostly outside of Europe. So then let's start thinking about what contribution can Europe make. And I put together 3 statements here that help us frame this discussion. There is much work done by the UN and others, many academics, that show in a business-as-usual scenario, the world is on course for at least 4 degrees C of warming by the end of this century. That's quite frightening. Some people put the number higher at 5 or even above that. Europe is proposing to take its emissions to zero, carbon emissions to zero, net zero, by 2100. Which sounds, and it certainly is, a laudable, applaudable objective. But then I quote the International Energy Agency leader, Fatih Birol, who said just a couple of months ago, if Europe follows this path and reduces its emissions to net zero by 2100, while others don't follow, it cannot change a single 0.1 degrees C in the global temperature increase. So it begs the question, what's the best thing that Europe can do to make a contribution here? And that's very much the point of the talk today. So let's just talk about refining competitiveness, because this is a journey we've been on for some years. And Spain is not alone in having been affected by these issues very significantly. Every refiner in Europe has been looking at these issues. So I put up a few charts, and I'll go through fairly quickly through this material. There's quite a lot of it. Top left-hand graph here, this is a graph of the trend in imports of fuel into Europe. And the basic takeaway from the top left graph is we have a trend of increasing imports of the fuel that we use in Europe. I'll show you another graph later. We're currently around 19% of imports, up from 13% a few years ago. On the right-hand side, we have refineries that are closing. And in fact, in the last 7 years, we've seen 15 refineries. We're down to about 82 right now. Back in 2000, we had over 100 refineries in Europe. And there is a continuing trend of refinery closures. On the bottom here, we show what is the competition globally. This is a huge refinery that has recently been built in India. This refinery is the size of over 10 European refineries in one site. That fuel comes into Europe every week, into the likes of Rotterdam and other deep water ports. This is the competition. This refinery here does not have to comply with European regulations. Energy costs is part of the picture here. This chart may be a little bit difficult to read, but the height of the bar represents the multiple in the cost of energy relative to Europe. And so taking the middle bar here on the left for natural gas, European Union has got 3 times the cost of natural gas in the US. And we're not alone there, but it just goes to show that the US right now has got a particular advantage in the cost of energy overall, in particular natural gas. And when that's converted to electricity, they also have a big advantage in electricity costs. We do expect some progress over the next few years as we get greater LNG imports and interconnections across Europe. We hope to see our gas prices come down. But right now, it's a really quite acute problem for all energy-intensive industries that use gas. We have additional policies in Europe that put additional competitive pressure. There are good reasons for these policies, but we should also recognize that they put in additional cost. We have policies that affect product demand, the Renewable Energy Directive, the Fuels Quality Directive. We've also had a situation where taxation has favored the use of diesel over gasoline, and that certainly had significant effects on the demand for products and the refining industry. Products that affect refining cost, ETS, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then policies that affect refiners' investments. There are pushes to get fuel sulfur out from marine fuels, and while that is an important thing to contribute to air quality, the lack of clarity over that regulation continues to cause problem. And then policies to control access to raw materials. We actually don't have free trade across the Atlantic in terms of crude oil. The US does not export its crude oil, and that actually gives a further advantage to a US refiner. So a US refiner has cheaper crude oil, and it has cheaper gas, and they can bring their products to Europe. So let's just work through that and show how that works in terms of the buildup of costs. This is a picture that we did showing the buildup of costs for, on the left-hand side of this chart, an average or generic EU refiner, and on the right-hand of the chart, an average or generic Middle Eastern refiner. And if you start from the bottom here, we assumed a constant crude oil price, or the same crude oil price for each refinery. And we added to that, first of all, labor cost. These numbers are in dollars per barrel of product refined. So you start off with each refinery there has about $1.6 per barrel of labor costs. And then the next block is maintenance and other, which includes catalyst costs, 1.1 for Europe and 0.5 for the Middle East. But then you come to the energy costs, where you see a huge difference emerge. In the Middle East, they will pay 70 cents a barrel for the energy that is used for refining, whereas in Europe we pay $4.5 a barrel, and that is a huge disadvantage for Europe. We believe it costs from the Middle East around $2 to bring it from the Middle East to Europe. So that closes the gap a little bit, but then we also have additional regulatory costs in Europe that apply only to the European refiner, not to the Middle East refinery. And the block on the top left here is the Industrial Emissions Directive and ETS costs. For 2020, we'll add nearly another $2 a barrel. So quite simply, it's cheaper to make your product outside of Europe and bring it into Europe. And that's something that we're now showing to the regulators to say, the European companies very much want to stay in business in Europe supplying European fuels, but we need to take stock of the competitive picture that we have globally. In fact, if you expand that to comparisons with not just the Middle East, but also with the US and Russia, here's the same data, but with US and Russia added. Europe is on the right-hand side here. These are basically the costs of production. You see Middle East, US, and Russia all have a competitive advantage. And it's no surprise that if you go to Rotterdam or Antwerp or other deep water ports across Europe, there are boats with diesel from these three regions coming in every day. In terms of carbon pricing and carbon trading schemes, the regions that we see bringing fuel into Europe, on this graph, regions that have carbon pricing or carbon management schemes are in green, and you'll see the fuel coming in from outside is predominantly from areas that do not have an equivalent policy. In terms of where are investments being made in our industry, this chart shows regions of the world with different investments that are announced in refining. On the far left-hand side, we have the Middle East. On the far right-hand side, we have Europe. In between, we have China, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and US. And the one thing that really stands out in this region is that the Middle East is investing very heavily to build refining capacity. And they are doing this to not only supply their own regions, but also to export to Europe. And these refineries are being built, like the picture I showed you earlier, very large refineries by deep water ports with excellent logistics to get that product into markets like Europe. We have high regulation costs. They do not. It opens up that competitive disadvantage for us. So it's a bleak picture that we'll actually see more refining capacity built in the next few years that will make the situation for Europe more challenging. In terms of the costs of ETS, we actually show, this is quite a technical chart, but how does ETS develop from phase 1 and phase 2, where we had effectively free allowances given to us by the Commission, recognizing the competitiveness challenge. But now the proposal that will actually increase the costs per barrel up to around 23-25 cents a barrel for additional costs from ETS. So you may ask, does it matter if we have our fuels supplied from outside of Europe? Well, I think companies here and the employees of the companies here would like to see a way to stay in business in Europe. So that's about the industry and jobs agenda. There's also something about the climate agenda. And this is some work that was done for the UK government by a consultancy called Vivid Economics, where they looked at the carbon emissions per barrel of European refineries, comparing with the average outside of Europe. And this simple chart shows that, on average, the refineries outside of Europe are higher in their emissions per barrel by about 35%. So actually we say there's also a very clear climate objective for keeping fuels refined in Europe for the European market. In terms of the trend then in imports to the European market, this top graph here shows in red the portion of fuels that are imported. And we've gone in 2004, 13% of imports to 19% of imports in 2014. Now, factoring in at that last point that refineries outside emit more CO2, it's possible to calculate that 19% of imports now accounts for 21% of the emissions as produced by refineries producing fuels for Europe. So if we continue that trend, even though we'll have a climate policy that appears to be reducing emissions in Europe, we'll actually be increasing the emissions globally. So that's just something that we ask to be considered by the European institutions. To, please help us keep our efficient refineries in Europe, the low emission, low CO2 refineries in Europe, be at the heart of supplying Europe's transport fuels. So some conclusions from looking at refining and the competitiveness issues there. We face very strong competition from outside of Europe, with much lower energy costs for other regions, and and they have also lower costs of regulation compared in Europe. Several regions may also have lower crude oil costs. We certainly know that US, Russia, and Middle East, in reality, have lower crude oil costs compared with Europe. The very high energy costs in Europe have actually encouraged European refineries to invest in energy efficiency. And that's now the main reason why we have very low CO2 emissions, relatively speaking. It's actually because of the energy costs. It's not clear that if we put further regulation on European refining, we'll actually save CO2 emissions. It may be that more refineries will shut and the real effect will be higher emissions. A bigger opportunity for Europe actually could be to encourage other world regions to adopt the same type of regulation that we have, and also to adopt some of the same technologies that we have in refining. In fact, many of the refining technology companies in Europe are looking for opportunities overseas to increase the efficiency of refineries overseas. So actually, instead of taking unilateral action in Europe, exporting our policy solutions and also our technologies potentially can make more contribution. Then let's look at transport. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. Transport is not in the ETS system and is subject to a variety of different regulations to try and reduce the carbon footprint. I think everybody's aware of efforts to do something in biofuels and also to do something with electric vehicles. And we believe in the association that one of the things that's missing from this conversation is a consideration of what is the cost of carbon in the different measures that we are looking at. and how putting a price on carbon would actually work in this conversation. It's worth considering today that the ETS price is around 8 or 10 euros a tonne of CO2, and that represents essentially something about switching fuels from, in particular, from coal to gas, and the costs of doing that at large scale. There are some arguments that that price is a little bit too low because there are too many tickets in the market. The Commission in Brussels certainly believed that a price of maybe 20 euros would be a fair price if those effects were not in play. But you just have that number in mind, 10 to 20 euros. Now, in terms of carbon costs and what should be the strategy thinking about carbon costs, the International Energy Agency set out a proposal back in 2009 for what was essentially a strategy for how to approach decarbonization across the whole of society, where essentially you look for the lowest cost solutions first and you move through the graph from left to right, going through end-use efficiency and then decarbonization of the power sector and then moving on to more expensive options later. And this was, I say, proposed in something like 2009. And what we have done in this graph here is tried to point out where the different regulations that we have in transport actually appear on this graph. And you'll see in red, picked out in red here, first of all, on the left-hand side, end-use efficiency in transport is something that Europe has done very well at. I think we will all have noticed that cars have become more efficient with lower CO2 numbers and better fuel consumption. And that's significantly as a result of Europe's regulation of car makers. And we believe that has done a very good thing. Actually, if you look at the cost of doing that, the cost of the engineering has put the cost of the car up a little bit. But then, of course, there have been fuel savings. So if you factor in the fuel savings offsetting the higher cost of the car, you may well have a zero cost for that decarbonization measure. That's excellent. It's just a fantastic value for society. But we should then look at some other measures, and the key measures in transport to then look at are biofuels and also electricity. So if we first look at biofuels, and I choose an example here, biodiesel, we actually show that if you look at market prices today for the cost of biodiesel today is around $750 a tonne, whereas petroleum diesel is about $450 a tonne. A tonne of biodiesel will save something like 1.5 tonnes of CO2 emission. So you're spending $300 extra for the fuel to get you 1.5 tonnes of carbon prevented. And so our maths shows that that's about $200 per tonne of cost of reducing carbon. Now, we believe that using a consistent carbon price across the strategy for decarbonisation is an important guide to what things we should do and what things we should not do. And then we could also have a conversation later, if you apply a carbon price, what do you do with the money that comes from a carbon price? That's maybe another or a later part of the conversation. But in terms of a strategy based around a consistent carbon price, actually you would not do biofuels if you were sticking with that strategy, because the carbon price doesn't cover that cost difference. Then let's look at something in electricity. And this is an example based around the idea of replacing a small to medium-sized car with a pure electric large battery car that is equivalent size. And we use here some data that was put together by the European Commission working with Concawe and the car industry, JEC Consortium, last year, looking at the true well-to-wheels numbers, the fully built-up life cycle numbers for energy for an electric car and also for the fuel we call B7 here is actually really the standard diesel in Europe, 7% biodiesel in petroleum. And so the diesel-powered car here running the B7 fuel would do 101 grams per kilometre. And the electric car, using the current European energy grid average, would do 57 grams per kilometre. That's a difference of 44 grams. So a saving of 44 grams of carbon for every kilometre the vehicle drives. And if you multiply that by the typical mileage of a vehicle, we've taken 200,000 kilometers over the life of the vehicle. That would give you a saving of 8,800 kilograms of carbon. And then we should consider what is the cost of putting that electric vehicle onto the road. And, sorry, do I have the summary of that? No, I don't. So we have done a short piece of work looking at the societal cost of getting that electric vehicle onto the road. And at the moment, we see something in the way of a manufacturer cross-subsidy. Both Tesla and also Daimler have said they make a loss on every car that they sell. We believe that's a few thousand euros. We do know that there's a government purchase grant of typically $5,000 or $7,500 euros per car towards every car that goes onto the road at the moment. There is also then a loss of fuel excise taxes of a few thousand euros per car over the life of the car. There are some fuel savings in that. We believe if you add all that up, it comes to at least 10,000 euros to get each additional electric car onto the road. And you save 8.8 tons. So that gives you a cost of carbon of something like 1,100 euros per ton. And we think when you look at the cost of that compared with the cost of doing things in the power sector, there's a huge difference. So if you were to look at how things would work if you were consistent, choosing solutions according to the cost of carbon and applying a carbon price, you can see that with cost of CO2 savings in electrification of light transport with big batteries, applying a consistent carbon price would get you nowhere near the kind of costs that you need. So we basically say that at the moment, according to the strategy that we believe we should have, according to the IEA, we may be too early pushing for full electrification of light transport. It's not good value. It's not good value for the user, and it's actually not good value for the planet. To spend 1,000 euros a ton, you could do 100 tons in the power sector with the same money. Just looking at the application of an economy-wide carbon price and what it would support, it's interesting to look, and actually this is, if you like, a development of the IEA cost curve. You've got efficiency that comes often at zero cost or even negative cost. You've got fuel switching in power, that's typically from coal to gas. Renewables in power, which is more likely switching from coal to photovoltaic solar or to wind power. And then you've got CCS. Currently, it's considered expensive when you're sitting in the power sector because CCS may come in at something like 70 euros. So if your current carbon price is 10 and the Commission is hoping for 20, 70 euros looks a long way off. Actually, if you're sitting in the transport sector and you're paying $200 for biofuels and 1,000 euros for electricity, CCS suddenly looks like a bit of a bargain. It's strange. We have this strange conversation in Europe where we have policies at each end, but somehow things in the middle we can't manage. And so this is where we believe the conversation needs to go. How do you apply a carbon price consistently? How do you then support the sensible next big steps and not try and pick winners from the far end of the graph that are very expensive? And even after several years of trying with improving biofuels and electrification, we still have very, very high costs. So we believe, actually, we should have a conversation back to how do we apply a carbon price consistently across the economy and then make the right things happen in the right order. So in terms of recommendations, we believe we need to focus on the cost, the lowest reasonable cost to the citizens and users of transport, and also the value to the planet for the money that we spend on decarbonisation. We should avoid extreme cost solutions imposed on drivers and businesses. This is not just about individuals. Every business uses vehicles at some point in its supply chain. We should pursue further efficiency gains. Efficiency is a win for everybody. We have to continue to pursue efficiency across all sectors. We must make the most responsible use of petroleum. It was an incredible gift of nature. We now know it has a downside, but let's be clear, it's a societal choice. As an industry, just in Europe, we have maybe 50 million customers every day. And actually, the biggest stakeholders in this are the customers, the governments that raise revenue from use of these fuels. And this actually comes bigger than the role of the refining industry. We should support new technologies needed for the long term. For sure, advanced biofuels and lower cost electrification are part of the future. It makes a great deal of sense in many ways. We should just be clear right now, electrification based on big batteries for passenger cars has really poor economics. We should be more flexible with this sectoral approach. Keeping transport outside of the ETS, we think, looks increasingly difficult to defend. At the margin of compliance with very ambitious targets in transport, we should consider how do we ask another sector to make the carbon savings at lower cost instead of driving very expensive solutions in transport. Also, we should aim to export our efficient transport technologies, our efficient products, and also our policies to help make that global playing field level, and also to pursue the bigger opportunities for decarbonisation that sit outside of Europe. So then, overall, some conclusions. What should climate leadership look like for Europe? Europe has done a great deal already. We have policies that are admired around the world. ETS is actually being copied by the Chinese. There is a pilot scheme, as we speak, to set up an ETS similar system in the US, in China. And we also have vehicle regulations for efficiency that have delivered very well so far and could be a model for other countries to follow as well. But we should be clear that further unilateral action by Europe risks making our economy and industries less competitive, losing jobs and know-how to outside of Europe. And the evidence is already there that that's happening. We also risk what we call carbon leakage as jobs in industries locate outside of Europe where they are under less regulation and they emit more as a result. So we can export our technologies, our products, and our solutions to the world. We can use our leadership position to influence other countries to follow. We have the expertise to set up things like ETS. We're helping to do that. We can then also, as Europe, if we have carbon markets and technologies outside, we can participate in global projects to reduce carbon emissions. Those global projects will be likely less expensive than high-cost solutions we could do in Europe. This would be climate leadership with the lowest costs for citizens and the best value for the planet. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions on any of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your very inspiring and exciting presentation. You have put a lot of hot issues on the table, and probably that means that there are going to be a lot of questions or remarks. So it's time to open the floor for any questions. Just raise your hand over there.
Okay, thank you, John. It's Marta Camacho from Repsol here.
Over there.
Here. Hello, thank you. Excellent presentation. You have been talking about European refining competitiveness, and you have been comparing mainly with the Middle East refining. But you haven't mentioned anything about the US situation with the refining sector and all the implication that oil ban has. Could you please elaborate a little bit about that? Thank you.
So it's a good question, and it's a very relevant one. The US benefits, first of all, from lower gas prices. And I think I said it's something like 3 times more expensive to buy gas in Europe than it is in the US. The US has benefited hugely from shale oil and gas exploration, and that has reduced their gas price because it's hard to export gas. You need LNG facilities. That is happening, but it's still given a very generous supply in the US. Also, it has reduced the crude oil cost. Further, we have a crude oil export ban in the US, and we have seen over the last 10 years the marker prices for crude oil between the US and Europe vary between about $3 and $10 a barrel. That means it's been somewhere between $3 and $10 a barrel cheaper to buy the marker crude oil in US versus Europe. So a combination of crude oil and gas costs in Europe, we think, gives a competitive advantage of at least $4 a barrel to refine in the US. And while it's not possible to export crude oil, it is absolutely possible to export diesel and other products and intermediate products from the US. And that is happening every day. It's coming into Europe every day. And that's one of the trends that we're seeing. And we have hoped for a lifting of the crude oil export ban in the US, but it looks like it'll get a veto and may well not happen. So we're not hopeful. The situation will probably continue.
More questions? Over there.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to have you here in Madrid and see your message is very, very clear. I wanted to comment in what is your view on in Paris to have the results of the COP21 possible agreement on fixing a price, a carbon price that, as you have said, is quite essential to have a very rational transition for the future to take rational decisions on the lowest technology. In Spain, we have seen how emotional decisions taken by the policymakers sometimes in supporting technologies too early have cost us, the citizens and industries, a fortune in the electricity for betting for a technology too early, and we have to pay for 30 years the high cost of those technologies in the price of electricity to all consumers. How think you this possibility will come from Paris to have a global price, at least in the short term?
Thank you, Alvaro. It's a very good question. So a little bit of optimism, I think, based on Paris, but only a little bit is probably the best way of putting it. There's been a great deal of preparation. I think what we see from this summit is the degree of preparation that has gone on for some months between the different countries of the world, and intensive negotiations in Bonn and other places as we've moved forward towards Paris. What's different about this summit is clearly the commitment of many countries, and I think to have seen on the television, I think it was 147 leaders, country leaders in Paris all at the same time. It was an extraordinary scene to see all of these together, committing and supporting together action on climate. From what we understand of reports so far, we are a long way short of a commitment to apply a global carbon price. And what we do see is a lot of, shall we say, pieces of patchwork commitments across some countries and some sectors and some wealthy individuals to put initiatives together that will create support for technology and some support for some carbon pricing measures. But it looks like we're a long way off from even a commitment to create a global system. And I guess I would go further and say what our industry needs for this to work is a carbon pricing system where you can see the effect in market prices. It's all very well ticking a political box saying, yes, we've done it, we've put a carbon regulation in practice. But if you're a fuel buyer for one of the major supermarkets, shall we say, and you go to buy your fuel from the Rotterdam market, you can have a choice of buying from that boat that's just come in from the US or the Middle East, where the fuel does not have a cost of environmental regulation, or from one of the refineries there along the harbour in Rotterdam that is fully under European regulation. And if you have a lower cost from buying outside of Europe, then that will happen, and it will happen more. And so what we need is actually a global system that actually turns up in market pricing. And I'm afraid I'm pessimistic on that, and we will have to remind our governments and our regulators that that's the objective. And until we get that, we have this risk of what we call carbon leakage. Every time somebody buys from outside of Europe, that's just exporting the emissions, and we know those emissions are higher. So, yes, it's a complex answer, but not a completely positive one. Thanks.
Thank you. That's one question, and after that, Carlos has another. Okay.
Thank you, John, for your clear explanation. I'm Salvador Guillén, Managing Director of CLH, the logistic company in Spain. Regarding to transport and the impact in the CO2 emissions, you mentioned that car electrification is not a cost-efficient solution for the future. You mentioned that we can increase the efficiency of engines, but which is your opinion about the capacity of impact in CO2 emissions of the future improvements in quality specifications of the petroleum products? Do you think that could be a cost-efficient way to reduce CO2, or the cost is not is more expensive than needed to be efficient in order to reduce CO2 emissions?
That's a good question. And I know that a lot of regulators are also interested in that sort of question. There's something about how do you improve fuels for efficiency, and there are other questions about how do you improve fuels for lower carbon intensity. In terms of efficiency, I guess it's something I said earlier. Petroleum is a gift of nature. It is what it is. And we have to be realistic that in order to benefit from its low costs, in order to benefit from its ability to raise revenue for governments, we need to recognize there's a limit to what we can do with it. The gains that are possible in efficiency, in my view, are still primarily with the engine, possibly some contribution from lubricants. It is clear that the lubricant technology that some of the companies represented here also offer has been very impressive, very low viscosity, very low friction lubricants, but they are essentially enablers for the engine system. So the opportunities are primarily, I believe, in the engine system and the transmission, and also the power consumption of the vehicle before you put the engine into it. And I believe that's probably where we should focus. The ability to make changes in fuel, I would say actually many of them have been done already. We have in Europe very highly specified fuels compared with much of the rest of the world, very tightly specified for emissions and for very low sulfur to keep the emissions low. I believe we've done most of the right things, and it's hard to see what else we can do with fuels. So I think we should focus on supporting the efforts of the regulators to get the right solution for energy efficiency. We've done a lot in cars. We haven't done much in heavy duty yet or other sectors. And that clearly seems an area where we can do more. Thanks.
We're there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, to Club, of course, for bringing John today here with us so that he could provide us with his very interesting opinion about these crucial issues. I'd like to take advantage of John's experience engaging on a daily basis with the European institutions. You've advocated in your presentation, and I couldn't agree more, with a more flexible approach in order to get transport decarbonization. However, our experience is that we have different targets being overlapped each other, with this command and control approach from the Commission, with renewable energy target in transport, carbon intensity reduction in transport, CO2 efficiency and consumption standards for vehicles. My question, John, is what's your outlook for the post-2020 scenario? Do you think that European institutions are willing to accept this more flexible approach in order to get these CO2 reductions in transport? I'm begging for an optimistic approach, please.
Well, okay. So again, I think it's an answer that is a bit mixed. Transport regulation has perhaps been the victim of some of the most volatile policies, may I say. And I think probably all of us here that work in energy would say that there's a benefit in having a real long-term view in policy and strategy for energy. Whereas in transport, we've probably had the typical life of a policy or an initiative that is even shorter than the life of a typical government. And we need to move on from that. And energy works in a much longer sort of wavelength. And really what I'd like to see is something that is a view connected to policy structure that is 20 or 30 years long, not 2 or 3 years long. We have learnt a lot in the last few years from things that we have done in transport. I think as in the introduction earlier, it was mentioned, I mean, I've been working in transport for nearly 30 years now. I remember in the earlier years, the big pushes for alternative energy were around things like methanol. Do you remember methanol? Anyone remember methanol as a fuel? M85 was going to be the big solution in California. Along the way, we've done hydrogen, CNG, LPG. We're back to electricity. We've done biofuels a couple of times. And typically the policies last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then people change their minds. We've just changed our minds again on food-based biofuels. The conversations in Brussels, I think you're asking, what are the conversations in Brussels? There is a lot of disappointment about how the world of biofuels worked out. And in the years of 2008, 2009, when the RED was being written and formed, the Renewable Energy Directive, people thought biofuels were almost like a silver bullet and were going to work for all sorts of different sectors. It hasn't turned out that way. Very soon after implementation, the ILUC debate started, and now, even though there is not really agreement on exactly what ILUC is, we certainly have an agreement that there is good reason to lower our expectations and to limit the contribution of food-based biofuels. Advanced biofuels, exciting, but A, expensive, and B, very limited. There could be some potential there, but there's a lot of work to do. On vehicle efficiency, the Commission, rightly so, believe that so far it has been successful. The car policy has delivered very cost-effective savings, but going further is harder, and going much further probably starts pushing you into some degree of electrification. And there again, we're 5 years down the road of policy support for electrification. And I think it's fair to say, even from the most strong supporters of the policy, there is some disappointment of the very small numbers of cars that we've got on the road, and the fact that car sales correlate with the incentives. When the incentives change, the electric car sales go down straight away. And so it's still a technology that is on support mechanisms. And it doesn't look like it's going to be able to be a major contribution to transport decarbonisation for some time, many years. It is simply true that the policy conversation around transport is tough, and we are invited ourselves, I'm looking, Alessandra, my colleague here, several conversations we've had with key people in the Commission. They have invited us to help brainstorm on this subject. There is a shortage of ideas. It is simply true that there's a recognition that we've done a lot already, not quite sure where to go next, certainly on fuels. There is an appetite to go further, for sure, on efficiency for cars. That is very clearly going to happen. And there is a lot of work trying to work out how do you do that for heavy-duty vehicles as well. And as an association, we support that. We think it should be done sensibly, and that there should be the right incentives, but also the right mechanism for any penalty for non-compliance in that subject. It needs to be connected to the carbon price conversation. Efficiency will happen. That's the optimism, I think, that I can bring into the conversation. What happens on fuels is very unclear, and so I can't really give you much clarity on that. Yeah, thanks.
Another question.
Yeah.
Alfonso González Finat, Acer Agency. Good morning, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to dwell on the transport sector. And I have maybe two comments or two questions to you. First, how do you see in the COP21 the transport sector being treated? You just mentioned it's a non-ETS sector, it's diffused. How do you see, and in particular, road haulage, you just mentioned that heavy-duty vehicles are maybe the difficult part. How do you see in COP21 the transport being discussed or being treated beyond biofuels? And my second point, or my second question, the European transport industry vis-à-vis this issue, is it neutral in respect of whether fuels are imported or produced or refined in Europe? How are you working with them? I mean, do you see eye to eye with them in those issues, or they say, I don't mind where the fuel comes from, so far as I can use them properly?
So the first question, COP21 and transport. Actually, I think what we see so far is very little discussion of transport. And certainly biofuels has had very little discussion. In fact, I'm just trying to think what I've seen in press coverage over the last week. I think one of the few things that I've seen that has come forward is an initiative by wealthy individuals, including Bill Gates, to promote the development of liquid fuels from sunlight, I think was the headline that I saw. I'm reminded of many efforts that have been done, including by many companies in Europe, around the subject, including using algae, for example. And we know that A, it works, and B, it's really expensive. I don't see anything else, I think. I'm not sure if anybody else would correct or add to that, but I don't see very much discussion about how to move with transport. And certainly a great deal of this is around the power generation sector and development projects around the world and funding for major power generation. I see some discussion this morning around electrification of Africa that Holland was talking about, and I think we would all understand that to mean bringing electricity to rural communities across Africa so that they can move on from making very inefficient combustion of whether it's coal or peat or biomass. The second question about the transport industry and their position on where are fuels manufactured. That's a good question. Actually, we don't think they have a position on that, and it's worth a conversation with them. What I would say is, in general, the transport industry, certainly the Automakers Association, they've been a little bit distracted recently with a certain issue arising from Volkswagen. We actually have a very good relationship with the transport associations, ASEA, and the other industries representing road haulage, etc. And I think we are contributing to their studies on what are the paths forward for decarbonisation of heavy-duty transport and other transport sectors. It's an important part to have a good view of the energy sector. So a very good dialogue. Actually, that is something that we will take from this question and have a discussion with them. So thank you.
Arturo Gonzalo from Repsol. Thank you very much, John, for a very interesting presentation and for your availability to come to Madrid when all roads seem to lead to Paris. But we've discussed before this, but I would like to listen to your ideas in this context. I think that nowadays air quality is seen as a very powerful driver for decarbonization in some places, for instance, in China. These days, we are having that debate here as well. Today in Madrid, there is a speed limit at 70 kilometers per hour because we are over the thresholds in NOx emissions. And everyone tends to mix everything up, and you listen to many people mixing climate change and air quality issues. Even many journalists make this mistake. And some people is reaching the conclusion that the only solution for air quality problems is to decarbonize transport and to phase out fossil fuels, and everything is being mixed up in this respect. So what do you think about this? How can we, on top of what we are already doing, and AOP is always trying to clarify these issues, as you do as well, but how can we avoid that we are asked to pay the bill for the problems created by others, be it municipal authorities that have very old buses, or be it automakers that try to create the impression that diesel technology has a limit and you cannot reduce emissions beyond that limit. Thank you.
So I think this links actually, it's difficult to avoid talking about Volkswagen at some point. And clearly there were already air quality concerns in cities. The Volkswagen issue brought greater awareness. But there's always something about conversations like this where a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, is the expression. And we suddenly have a lot of experts in air quality and emissions from vehicles. I think one of the things I would say is, you look at the study that broke the news about Volkswagen. It was done by the University of West Virginia, a small group of vehicles with on-the-road testing. One of those vehicles passed everything. It was a BMW X5. It had good equipment on the vehicle, AdBlue system, and it passed the requirements fully of the regulations, both on the road and off the road. That's an indication that the technology exists today, it's in production, and it works fully. We actually have additional measures already in the pipeline in Europe. We have got already in the pipeline a new drive cycle for vehicles, for all types of vehicles, petrol, diesel, everything. And we also have an expected move to testing of real driving emissions, which means you put the analyzers in the car and you drive it on real roads. All of that was going to happen anyway. The Volkswagen scandal accelerated that. That will happen. Further, there is even a Euro 7 level of emissions that is in the works, and eventually this will come forward. We, as an industry, I believe we should support this. It comes back completely to the responsible use of petroleum. Responsible use means maximum efficiency and very best possible air quality. And I would say, let's not be too pessimistic about what can be achieved. In the early days, and I go back to much earlier in my career, in the early days when California was proposing very tough emission standards for gasoline vehicles, the car makers said it wasn't possible. And 3 years later, they were meeting it. Today, we have vehicles that burn gasoline that if you test them in the laboratory when they're hot, then the emissions from the tailpipe can be at a lower concentration than the ambient air. This is a common problem in vehicle emission testing, that the emissions are so incredibly low from a gasoline vehicle that they're immeasurable or they get lost in the ambient air. They can even be lower in hydrocarbon concentration and overall pollutant concentration in the tailpipe than the ambient air. That's a very well recognized phenomenon now. That's been achieved in gasoline. It's interesting to think, what can we achieve in diesel technology as well? And there is very good money being spent in European companies, in exhaust after treatment, chasing ever lower standards of diesel emissions. And so we believe it's possible, it will happen, the right regulatory tools are in place. Actually, if you look at what's contributing to air quality problems in cities now, it's older vehicles. We don't have the in-use standards that test vehicles very thoroughly and get them off the road if they're performing badly. And if you do the maths of what a vehicle can emit when it's not running properly, one vehicle out of 1,000 can double the emissions of the fleet of 1,000 vehicles. And so the economics of doing this come down to, how do you get the hyper emitters off the road? And usually, the good news is, these are usually vehicles that are very low in value because they're very old and they're very badly maintained. So instead of focusing on how do you replace the vehicle with an even more expensive vehicle, you take the action where it's most cost effective. You chase that cost effectiveness angle. How do we get the oldest vehicles off the road? And then we'll carry on the path that we're on to sensible but very, very good regulation of air quality. And that will enable us to continue to make responsible, efficient and clean use of the fuels that we have.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, please.
Definitely take one from the youth table, yes.
Hi, I'm Andra from Repsol, one of the young professionals. Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. Yesterday, I heard the Commission speaking at the ENVI committee about the refining fitness check. And they was explaining their conclusion about the report that they're going to publish in the coming weeks. What do you think about the conclusion, and what do you think about the period of the study? Because the Commission said that they don't want to expand the period and that they don't take into account the last 3 years.
Okay, impressive question and very relevant question. So the refining fitness check. The first thing we would say is we're really happy that it happened. And it is an indication of a much better recognition in the Commission of the competitiveness issues that we have in the industry, and that the jobs and growth agenda really is alive in Brussels. So first of all, we're really pleased that it's happened. Secondly, it does only go to 2012. Things take time. Studies like that take time. Certainly they do in Brussels. And actually much has changed since then. And the data that we've shown here today is actually data that we are already proposing for the next refresh of the fitness check. And you've seen exactly the same charts that we showed to members of the Commission. And it is already recognized that there is a further story that we need to factor in. In particular, the costs of regulation that are proposed. We see a possibility, and you've seen the numbers, of how do we extrapolate that cost out to 2020, and we should consider that. So just doing it retrospectively, looking backwards, is good, but we need to do more than that. What do we think of the conclusions? Well, the conclusions mostly are good. We are particularly concerned that we have not yet had one part of that conversation to our satisfaction, and that is, can refiners pass through the costs of higher regulation? You've seen the bar chart that we've showed. You've seen that the costs for a European refiner are higher than those for an importer, for a producer outside. And we have the simple point that, sorry, let me just stop there before I make the simple point. The Commission, certainly the climate part of the European Commission, DG Klima, believe that the European industry can pass through the costs of regulation fully to customers. And we say, it's not as simple as that. We don't believe we can. If we tried to, I remind you of that graph I showed a few minutes ago. If European refiners try to pass through the costs, what they do is they increase that gap between a European refining supplier and one outside of Europe. What you've just done is increased the margin for an importer. You've just made the European market more attractive to somebody from outside of Europe as a target market. And what would be the result? You'd expect to see greater imports. So it's one of those things where if we pass through, we lose. If we don't pass through, we lose. And so we think the Commission has been very simplistic in how they've approached that. We are still having a lot of conversations to try and get that point across. Can we take one more question from the youth table, please? Yeah. Seeing as we had that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your presentation. Laura García Chiquero from the Youth Committee and CEPSA. This is related with COP21 and a little bit the view beyond 2020. You are a former VP, and Total, they just announced that by 2020 they plan to have a 20% investment in solars. How do you see the other majors? Do you see a new trend of renewables once they fail in 2000, 2001 and they divest everything? How do you see the other companies acting related with the new green trends?
Okay, good question. I should be really clear. I'm here representing FuelsEurope, so I'm not going to speak for BP, but I can speak for all of the industry, what I see, and certainly report back what we're seeing so far. So many of the leading companies in Europe in petroleum are now part of a coalition called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative that are strongly supporting the Paris talks and a commitment to stabilize carbon to hopefully achieve stabilization at or below 2 degrees C. And in fact, a subset of those are also supporting strongly a call for pricing of carbon. And I believe we'll see more activity around that. There was a press release yesterday from the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. I think if you go and Google carbon pricing leadership, you'll find that. And there are something like 20 countries and 90 companies supporting knowledge sharing to try and promote carbon pricing. We think that's a really positive initiative, and we're hoping to see more along the way. The story of investment in renewables is a bumpy one, to be honest, for many European companies. And the names that have spent a lot of money in that area include the big names of Europe: Total, BP, Shell, Repsol, Eni, and Neste, I guess, is a Finnish company. The results have been mixed, I would say, and in the most part, where success has happened, it's often been supported by policy, and the problem with the policy is, will it outlast the next election? It's back to that point about how long does a regulation in Europe last. There has been some technology around solar and wind that some of those companies have supported. Sometimes it's been other companies as well. And certainly in parts of the world, the use of solar and wind now for sure is competitive with coal-fired power generation, and that's good news. But it's a very bumpy ride, and it's still very tough making an investment proposition around renewables. And I would only use the example in Spain here of Abangoa, that is now seeking a path towards bankruptcy, where they have done an admirable thing trying to build a business model substantially about renewables, but one that ultimately depends very much on policy. And while we have a world where governments don't stand up and say, we need to move to renewables, and that means paying more for something more for the energy, where they don't do that, and instead they say on one day they'll say we need more renewables, and on the other day they'll say we need to keep energy costs down. Without connecting those two subjects, we won't make the progress, because the simple truth is, in most cases, renewables still costs more than the incumbent fuels. So that's the challenge we have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think that we have to finish. It has been very, very interesting. There are a lot of questions, even from my side, but I'm not going to ask. And so thank you very much, John Cooper. I will give the floor to Pedro Mero if you want to close the session.
Nothing else. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, and thanks to John once again.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Sure.